In this topic, we are going to talk about how we can identify query performance issues. We really don't have any as of right now, since we've only pulled in our data from our raw tables. So let's go ahead and create some steps to clean up this data. For example, I'm going to get rid of all columns except for the first 6 columns. I'm going to remove the other columns. You don't really have to follow these steps. I'm just going to try to show you an example here. Let's change the type of our order ID to be text. And I'm going to do something a little bit more strenuous here. I'm going to filter our customer ID where it's greater than or equal to, let's say, an arbitrary 300. And I'm going to replace all of the null values with a 999. So basically I have a lot of steps here. And if we click close and apply, we'll see how long this really takes to make the connection, the transformations, and load that data. Probably shouldn't take that long, but I don't know if you noticed that actually takes a little bit longer than just the raw data pull, because each step is asking our query to do a little bit more and change up some data and refine it a little bit to our likings. But the point of this video is to really see what this really is doing on the back end. So if you look at our navigation steps and we right click, we have the options to view the native query. This is showing what it's doing on the back end. So one main point of this is that if you have a lot of steps within Power Query, is going to run sequentially and is going to take more and more time for each step. Especially a lot of these steps where you're placing values and having to do a lot of the searching and filtering. Basically, if you reduce the number of steps, you will probably reduce your load time. But another very important idea when connected to database is the idea of query folding. Query folding is the idea of basically pushing a lot of your transformations back to your data source instead of doing them in Power Query steps. So for example, we are connecting directly to our sales order table. In this navigation step, we can right click and view the native query, and we see our query that's sent directly to our database table. So we see that we are bringing back the order ID, the customer ID, and all these different columns from sales.orders and aliasing it as table. So that's basically everything we're doing up to that step. And then we apply this step to remove the other columns directly in Power Query, meaning this should be a Power Query step, not a SQL step. The Power BI and Power Query in general is very smart, and that it can push back some of these transformation steps back to the data sources. So if you right click now and look at the native query, we will see that this is actually sending to our database just to select these 6 columns from sales.orders. So we actually haven't applied any Power Query steps yet. And the rule here is that it's going to be much faster if you apply the transformation to your database or your data source instead of applying the Power Query transformations. So we then change the type and we can look at the native query. We see that everything is still good at sending a different query and now converting that number into a text. We can see how filtered work. So view native query. We see that now we have this extra step where clause, where customer ID is a greater than or equal to 300. Let's look at the replaced values. We can still see a view native query where we're replacing some here. So we see that right there. In case when picked by person ID is null, then 999. So that's perfect. So let's try to introduce a step that can't be replicated in SQL. For example, I'm going to fill these nulls, not by a value, but I'm actually going to fill them down. This is a very handy Power Query function. So if we click on the back order ID and we go to the transform tab, we have this fill option. So if you want to fill down, you're actually going to see that the node turned to a 48 since that's what was directly above it. And now we've basically just added to our data set here. We filled in all the nulls based on the values that's directly above it. But that filled down option isn't something that we can replicate in a SQL language. So if you right click, we will actually see that we do not have a view native query option here. So now every other step that we apply in Power Query, for example, if we only select a few rows here, this all actually is taking place in Power Query, meaning the last two options here, these last two steps have not been written back to the SQL Server data source. So basically we want to move as many of our steps that we can write back to SQL in the beginning of our query execution, and we want to leave the Power Query steps towards the end. That's going to speed up our connection to our database, speed up the data load process drastically. So just so you know, I'm going to delete all these extra steps here by clicking delete until the end, and I'm going to get back to